Ready? Hello, welcome to this presentation. My name is Fernando Velez, and I work for a company called Vertex since 5 weeks ago. So Vertex is a provider of solutions for indirect tax determination and compliance returns across different countries. But the work I'm going to present today was done when I was working for a company called Persistent Systems, which is an integrator, a mid-sized integrator with around 20,000 people. And I was their chief data technologist, and I worked on building data strategy offerings, data governance offerings, and playing with data for innovation. And so in doing so, the data strategy initiative that I saw and I was engaging with always stumbled with this aphorism by Peter Drucker, apparently, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so I got curious and I tried to understand a bit better, and this is the result of that understanding, of that work. So in one word, you know, data culture happens within an organization, and therefore, as we will see, and I will try to convince you, the latter shapes the former. The organizational culture shapes your data culture, which is why I think now that companies should start by analyzing their culture types. And so the approach I suggest is to present you with a way to assess organizational culture. I have the source here, it's a clickable link. And then, after we have enumerated the values and practices of what makes a mature, data-driven culture, I will map these values and practices onto each of the culture types. Sometimes the mapping is not very straightforward, sometimes it is. And with this mapping, the belief is that you will be better equipped to know what's hard, what's easy, and then adjust your roadmap and your journey to become data-driven. And so this is the one slide I want you to remember. I started with this for you to remember. If this is one thing, this is it. Okay. So what I just mentioned is the green part. Before I will talk about the data culture challenge, and then some vocabulary to talk about cultures in general. And then at the end, I will end up with my own interpretation as to why it has been so hard. And then some recommendations on how to proceed, how to take this into account for your data journey. So you have seen that data initiatives have become mainstream. Let me check if we're okay. Yeah, I think we are. Okay. Can you still hear me? Okay. And then even strategic initiatives worth more than 50 million are commonplace, over 62%. And there have been even demonstrable progress. All of this shown in successive yearly surveys by New Vantage, the now famous big data and analytics thing. So companies, however, are not getting their value worth, because it's the challenges are on the people and process front, not on technology, as ascertained by over 92% of people. And in more detail, what seems to be hurting is this culture thing. And it's even getting worse, right? So down from 28% to 24% in 3 years. Have you forged a data culture? Only 1/5 of them, and getting worse. Have you created a data-driven organization? Only 24%, down from 31%. And then other things where I'm saying they're not, they are investing, but they're not getting as much as they should. They're not driving innovation as much. They're not competing with analytics as much. They're not managing data as a business asset. And only 30% of them have crafted a a data strategy. Okay, so here's my one slide trying to have a common vocabulary about all these things. Culture, organizational culture, data culture. So Data culture is a layer of organization culture, and in itself a layer of culture. Culture understood as collective mental programming. So you as a human being, we have a human nature that is universal and is inherited. As an individual, you have your personality, one or many if you are Sybil. But then by your belonging to different communities, your organization or your nation or your generation or your religion, then you then have this thing called culture, which is kind of unavoidable and unescapable, and it's learned as opposed to inherited. So organizational culture here, I show it as a layer of culture, and data culture is a layer of organizational culture. That's when looked in the x-axis, but then on the y-axis, looking deep, you start with this thing called values, which are often invisible, and that denote a preference about certain state of things as opposed to others. So for example, what is good with respect to what is bad? Or what is normal with respect to what is abnormal? What is rational with respect to what is irrational? And so on and so forth. And then going upwards to the more visible, then you have rituals, which are collective gatherings that celebrate the values in one way or the other. And then you have heroes that exemplify a person that with the right values, and then symbols that convey meaning that let's say make it permanent. All of these are collectively called practices, and I will talk about values and practices going forward. So every culture has an invisible or mostly invisible set of values, and then a set of practices that are very visible. Now, let's talk about this conflicting values framework, which is the method for characterizing and even measuring organizational culture. So it's based on 2 dimensions. Here's the first one. The first dimension differentiates an internal focus versus an external one. And then on the y-axis, there is a differentiation between stability, order, and control versus flexibility and dynamism. Now, these 2 dimensions have been shown to characterize most of the cultures according to these authors, and that may be the reason why it's become so popular. In the scholars that try to analyze, for example, national cultures or generational cultures or these other more general cultures have other dimensions beyond these 2. But they have these 2 as well. This one, well, the first one is called uncertainty avoidance, because what is external is kind of uncertain. And this one here is called power distance, because the more stability, order, and control, then the more you are under power. And then power distance is the acceptance by the collectivity of the unequal distribution of power. But then there are others, for example, long-term versus short-term, or masculinity versus femininity, or others. But then in the realm of organizations, they have been shown to be less impactful. So that's why we go only with these 2. Now, let me then talk about these 4 quadrants. In the external focus and stability and control, then you have what we call a market culture that is characterized with values that have to do with results in the market. And then a theory of effectiveness that has to do with achievement on strategic goals and competitive advantage. And the success is measured and understood in terms of profitability and market share. On the stability and control bit, but then internal focus, we talk about a hierarchy culture where the main value is efficiency, and it's all about controlling with structure, rules, and capable processes, and have efficiency and predictability as the measures of success. Now, you on market, I can tell you the typical example of a market company is Amazon. The typical example of a hierarchy culture organization culture is Goldman Sachs or Wells Fargo or IBM at the beginning, or in their midlife, I would say. Clan, the typical example of, okay, so clan, the values is friendship and loyalty. It feels like a family. And then the effectiveness is human development and teamwork. The success is good internal climate and employee satisfaction. What's a typical example of a clan culture company? Google is. And then adocracy. Here, the main value is creativity and risk-taking to win in the market with a unique idea. And so the effectiveness is innovation and rapid growth, work like an enterprise, entrepreneurial innovation, and the success is the production of unique products and services. And the archetype of this company is Apple, right? Okay, so that's the model. There is an assessment that comes with it. It's administered to people in the organization. We ask people to divide 100 points. There's 4 different statements on 6 dimensions of culture. I won't go through it. Total is 24 questions total. You distribute the points, and at the end, you get something like this. So every company has a little bit of everything and should have a little bit of everything, right? Here, this company has more market than anything else, has some hierarchy, but then less on the adocracy and clan. Quite typical of a quote-unquote normal company, as I will talk about in the end. And then importantly, not every single team or functional unit in the company has exactly the same culture. There may be some changes, and it's normal that some functions have some type of culture. For example, service organizations are more on rules and stability for obvious reasons. And everybody needs to have a little bit of everything. Now, let's talk about data culture. And data-driven culture, which I'm calling the latest stage of, let's say, evolution on data-driven, on data cultures. And so the main value is putting data in the front and center to take decisions and to generate insights and take decisions. And so there are other stages: data denial, data indifference, data aware, data informed, each of them with their own values, of course. And I'm interested here in the data-driven values. But then the picture is, once you have that value, then you have a strategy to use that data, massage it in a way that it's trustable and secure, and you can get insights. And then importantly, once you have those insights, it's not finished. It's even the beginning only, because that's where you need then to act, make the change happen, take the decisions, innovate new products, or acquire more customers, or do whatever you need to do that is in accordance with your business strategy, right? So more formally, these are the 2 main values of a data-driven culture. Data is a core strategic asset, and data-driven decision mindsets. That means that you take decisions with data that informs the decision, but then that doesn't mean that you don't use your instincts and your brain. Of course you do. It's only about having data that informs you. Now, you should be accountable as a principal, and this is super important, because only like that you will be able to recognize what works and what doesn't. And when it doesn't, then you will be able to then learn what went wrong, and then learn and be better. Everybody has to do with data. Everybody's a data worker. Some people call this data democratization. And then data must be used ethically. So I won't go through all of these values and practices in lots of details, but then I will mention them because I will refer to them in the sequel. So data leadership is a practice that starts from the top. Data needs to be aligned with the business strategy in order to be worth anything. That is done through goals and metrics and success because otherwise you won't be able to gauge whether you are going anywhere. Data governance, of course, is there to make your data trustable and secure. You need to have an inquisitive and objective attitude to learn for experiments, because data is for everybody, and everybody's a data worker. Then you need to be literate, and there are different levels of literacy depending on your role, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then data sharing is necessary because the insights go beyond just one team and one business unit. You need to know, to integrate data and from different places, and need to collaborate around the data. And then monitor improvement and data adoption and culture change. That's another important set of practices of data culture. So these here, I have gathered through reading, many different authors, so Gartner, O'Reilly, HBR, several of them. I think I have gathered like the gist of it. By no means I claim to have, gotten them all, but I think they have the gist of it. Now, I'm on to mapping the values and onto culture types, which is the central point on my stuff. And when mapping a practice to a quadrant or a value to a quadrant, we hypothesize a belief that the culture type of the organization facilitates the establishment of the practice, and that the value of the organizational culture type are in sync with the data culture value, with the data-driven culture value. So for example, here, data literacy is one example of a practice that naturally goes to the clan type of culture, because it's all about human development and human happiness, as it has been shown. People are happier, and it's a better workplace when you are trained and literate. So let me start one by one. Data literacy from the top. This is where all begins. Everybody talks about this, and it's true. But then the CDO who impersonates this is more about influencing change and shift your culture. It has an influencer role. Why? Because according to this survey, most of them has no revenue responsibility, and half of them have authority and responsibility for data. So they are more leaders than managers. And so the leadership roles that resonate more with that kind of influencer type CDOs come from the adocracy and the clan type of cultures. So you need an innovator to be an innovator for creativity, which comes from the adocracy culture type. You need to communicate, which is the kind of a broker role, also typical from the adocracy culture type. And you need a mentor role to motivate others, which typically comes from a clan culture. Okay? So influencer type CDOs generally have to come from these, have to have these qualities from this type of cultures. But then when CDOs have revenue responsibilities, they need to have qualities from all the quadrants. And that may explain why it's so hard and why most of them have no revenue responsibility. That's my own interpretation. Okay, let me now map values and practices from my long list onto the market culture. So alignment with the business strategy, the reason why I mapped it is because the data strategy should start with the desired business results, desired business outcomes. Even though at a given point in time, the business strategy may not necessarily be all about winning in the market. It may be, for example, let's be compliant to GDPR, okay? Goals, metrics, and success criteria, it's because obviously the results are expressed in these terms. And here, the word of caution is that they need to be defined with care, because that will shape behavior, because what you measure is what you manage, and what you manage is what people are supposed to behave as, and then in the long run, that will shape the culture. And then accountability for decisions, which is a management principle that could also be associated to the hierarchy culture type. And it's a necessary precondition to learn and grow, as I said. Now, the status of this is worryingly, half of the managers are not being held directly accountable on the quality of their decisions. Only 50% are, and the remaining 50% to various degrees. On to the hierarchy culture mapping. So data governance. Data governance is all about rules and structure to manage the life cycle of the data. And so that comes naturally to a hierarchy culture. Now, it's an investment for the data to be managed as an asset, which is the value. This is one of the visible practices of the value of data being an organizational level asset. And what's important about this is that it is permanent. And so ROI metrics are key for the governance program to survive the test of time. Pervasive, easy access to data from everywhere. So that's kind of data democratization, which has the potential for efficiency, which is why it has been ascribed to the hierarchy culture, but also for innovation, right? As some of the speakers in this conference have made the point. And it's the precondition to make everybody a data worker as well, along with data literacy and trust in the data, which will come in a second. And then ethical use of data, because it needs rules, it needs guidelines. It's now à la mode because of the compliance to privacy laws and to gain your users' trust. But then worryingly, ML models, which are things that also need to be governed for bias and fairness, we are not there yet. Only 20% of organizations address this. So we have a long way to go. On to our clan culture. So collaborative, multifunctional teams, because of their teamwork and internal mobility, and data mesh is today's popular approach to make the business and the data and analytics work together for responsiveness. Data literacy is all about human development, and the level of literacy depends on who you are. If you are an analyst, then you need it to make correct inferences, to be able to communicate with visualizations. If you're a manager, you need to ask probing questions of the data, or push back if you believe that the experiment is not well designed. And the DNA teams, well, literacy equates to data management skills. Culture of data sharing. This is important because beyond the technicalities of governing and integrating data, sharing requires trust in that the data will be used to a good effect. So this is why it requires loyalty and good internal climate, which is typical of a clan culture. And then on to the adhocracy culture, data-driven decision mindset, which is the critical tenet and the critical value of data culture, one of the critical ones. It liberates people from the hippo rule, which is the highest paid person opinion. And that makes more junior people test their ideas and innovate. But then it's still work in progress because only 58%, according to our recent survey, practice this. Inquisitive, objective attitude to learn from experiments. Now, this is excellent enabler of innovation, which is why it's on the adhocracy side. And the freedom to look beyond the obvious with new tools and techniques have been shown to work. And companies such as Google, for example, have popularized the Friday afternoon to do whatever you want in terms of playing with data and innovating with data. But only 48% of the respondents of this survey are driving innovation with data. And then improvement in data adoption and cultural change. This needs creativity, it needs influence, and there is two ways to this. This is monitoring tangible data adoption, and you can do that by measuring data access, data governance, data quality, and data literacy. Those are things that you can measure. Thank you. And then less tangible are cultural changes because there are organizational transitions, and then they could be used through this suite of tools called organizational network analytic tools that try to measure the communication, the intangible communications that happen between your people, and you could use them, and people are using them more and more. Okay, so summarizing. Data practices require traits from all the culture types. So you need flexibility, you need stability, the same way that you need innovation and you need productivity. So you need it all. And here is like a summary of what I just said. This is not incompatible with an effective organization. There are well-known organizations where the climate is fun, yet you have to to respond to hard-driven goals, and measures. So this is not incompatible, but it's hard. You need to have the right balance of everything. Now, why has it been so hard? Well, here is my guess. After observing more than 1,000 organizations, the authors of this marvelous CVF book, which I recommend you reading if you're interested, found that top leaders believe they are in a clan. And so they may be biased in believing that the team collaboration, data sharing practices may come easy to them. But then the rest of the company doesn't think like that. It's a bias that the top leaders have, that they are like in a clan. Over time, the second thing that was found by these people is that organizations gravitate towards hierarchy and market culture. It's almost as if gravity takes over, and it's difficult for them to develop traits from the cultures of the two upper quadrants. And this, to me, is perhaps one of the main culprits. Top-down decision-making is very hierarchical, right? And it lacks the empowerment and the flexibility and the dynamism to understand and to play and to innovate and to experiment with data. And then last, adhocracy scores are very low. And so the mindset to be entrepreneurial, to experiment and to innovate is the least common of the data practices and attitude that we have found. So my final slide, just in time for a couple questions, perhaps. You should analyze your own culture type. You should, of course, as I said, many times in these data strategy offerings that we built at Persistent through the years, you should analyze the maturity of your data practices. But not only your data practices, your culture types as well. With those two things, you should sort out the data culture values that are easier to establish given your culture type, and the harder ones. That will be your cultural complexity axis. I'm not sure that there is a business value axis on all this, because that will mean that some value is better than some other practice. So I didn't venture to do the traditional thing. But then you should adjust your roadmap starting where it's harder. Adjust your roadmap in your journey accordingly. Pay attention to the harder things and work out the right upskilling strategy and the right hiring profile, given where you are in terms of culture. Okay, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, if there is any. Yep.
We use a different values framework, but you should be able to take this type of approach and map it onto your own values framework, basically, if you've got one. Is that what you're saying? Or
yes.
Do you think you don't have to use this particular?
No, you don't. You don't. This one happens to be the most widely used, and it's very easy. And it captures the conflicting nature of these four quadrants, which you have to have a little bit of each. And so it's very good in that respect. Thank you very much.